Today we're going to examine a theory and framework that was created by poet Gregory Orr. And this is the Four Poetic Temperaments. Now those temperaments are impulses that motivate a poet's choices when he or she is creating a poem. And those four temperaments are story, structure, music, and imagination. Now, poets always want their works to be dynamic, and one way of making a poem dynamic and complex is to create tension. Story and structure are limiting impulses, whereas music and imagination reach toward limitlessness. So setting one of the limiting impulses against one of the impulses that reach toward limitlessness is a wonderful way to create artistic and literary tension in a poem. This also makes a poem dynamic. Most poems will exhibit multiple impulses, but one impulse will often dominate and the other three will be present in much smaller proportions. That friction that results from setting these opposing impulses against one another is very satisfying for a reader. It's part of what creates the mystery of poetry. So story is one of the two limiting impulses, and we recognize this when we encounter a poem that has a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And often that means we would also describe the poem as a narrative poem. Now, the line between lyric and narrative poetry can get kind of fuzzy, and so the poem doesn't necessarily have to follow this chronological structure and might not even organize that beginning, middle, and end according to what we perceive to be a logical chronology, but there's still that structure of a progression of events happening across some kind of timeline. The other element of story is a dramatic focus, and by dramatic I mean we have some kind of characters or figures in the poem that are engaged in a conflict of some sort, and over the course of the poem that conflict escalates to crisis and resolution of some kind. Some poems in our textbook, The Making of a Poem, that exhibit this impulse quite strongly are The Changeling, Ozymandias, and the Book of Yolek. Now for The Changeling, what we can see very clearly is that music is a kind of counter impulse. In Ozymandias, music is also the counter impulse. Both of those impulses are present and clear in the poet's structure of the poem and in his or her use of language. But story is the stronger of the two. In the Book of Yolek, story is also the dominant impulse, but imagination is its counter impulse. Structure is the second limiting temperament, and it is defined by measurable patterns in the poem. So poems that are exhibiting structure as its primary temperament they possess a beauty and balance that's very similar to what we would find in mathematical structures. And poems that exhibit structure as the primary impulse exhibit a high degree of obedience to known conventions. So it would make sense that many of the villanelles, sestinas, sonnets, pantoums that we read, the odes, the elegies, the pastorals, those that adhere very strictly to the conventions of that form would be leaning heavily on this structure impulse. Some poems in our book that illustrate this one very clearly include To My Sister, Diving into the Wreck, and Villanelle in the Middle of the Night. To My Sister has music as its counter impulse. Diving into the Wreck clearly has imagination as its counter impulse, and Villanelle in the Middle of the Night also has imagination as its counter impulse. So the tension comes in the pull between structure and then one of these other two impulses that reach toward limitlessness. Music is one of the two limitless impulses, and a poem that utilizes this or is working from this temperament, it emphasizes and elevates the pleasure of rhythm and sound. And this kind of poetry would prioritize the percussive and tonal modulations of rhythm that result from using word choice and syntax and punctuation to create pitch, stress, silence, and other sound effects like rhyming and alliteration, assonance, consonants, etc. Some poems in our textbook that illustrate this impulse very clearly include "O Captain, My Captain," "Yes," and "Sestina." With the first two of those examples, Captain, "O Captain, My Captain," structure is also present in the poem, but it is a kind of counter impulse to the primary impulse. For "Yes," structure is also the counter impulse, but in Sestina we see a real balance between music, which we might say is the primary impulse, and structure, which is a parallel impulse. Imagination is the fourth of these poetic temperaments, and poems that exhibit this particular impulse would use language that creates or follows an associative movement from image to image or thought to thought. So rather than being organized by chronology or by rhetorical logic, where you're making an argument or moving across a known space, to achieve spatial movement, or even some kind of emphatic order. In this kind of poem, imagination will move the language, the imagery, the ideas associatively. So we might say this is very similar to the stream of consciousness technique that we might find in prose. The imagery used in poems that are dominated by the imagination impulse can either be concrete, so that they appeal very much to our senses and present things to us that are perceivable or knowable from the world we inhabit, or can be very abstract, so they're conceptual. The emphasis is placed on the cognitive leaps necessary to connect these ideas or sensory perceptions. Some poems that illustrate the imagination impulse include Australia, 1970. In that poem, imagination is definitely the dominant impulse, but structure is also present, and so that helps us to navigate the poem and creates dynamic conflict there, dynamic tension. Iris is another good example of the imagination impulse. Story is its counter impulse. And then the tiger is another excellent example of imagination. However, structure in this poem is also really, really strong because of the stanza shape, the use of rhyming, and metrical patterns there. The sources for this particular framework are an essay, Four Temperaments and the Forms of Poetry by Gregory Orr, and you can find that in an anthology of essays titled Poets Teaching Poets. And then all of the poems that I referenced to illustrate these impulses are found in The Making of a Poem, a Norton Anthology of Poetic Forms, edited by Mark Strand and Eben Boland.